Robert Mueller's indictment of Russian nationals landed with a boom in the United States. Even President Trump's national security advisor, H.R. McMaster, said that the evidence of Russian meddling in the 2016 presidential election was now really incontrovertible. President Trump later tweeted his satisfaction with those remarks, but we didn't hear much from Moscow on it except for a few dismissals. So I wanted to talk about that and the effect the indictments will have on U.S.-Russian relations. Joining me now, Stephen Cohen is a professor emeritus of Russian Studies, History and Politics at NYU and Princeton, and David Sanger is a national security correspondent for the New York Times and a CNN national security contributor. Steve Cohen, let me ask you, Mueller's indictments, of course, are symbolic or meant to persuade. None of these people are ever going to see the inside of an American courtroom. They're all Russians. But I suppose they were meant to convince those Americans who doubt that there was, in fact, a systematic Russian government effort to interfere with the 2016 elections. You have always been skeptical that there was such a plan, that it was some kind of great crime and it needed to be investigated. Are you now convinced?
Absolutely not. Let me issue the obligatory disclaimer. I am not, nor have I ever been, a supporter of Donald Trump, but I am a supporter of facts. Let's remember what this story is, because it's the overarching narrative in which Mueller and this investigation operate. According to this story, Russian leader Putin directed a kind of attack, they say, on American democracy in 2016, which included stealing Mrs. Clinton's emails and disseminating them, as well as these social media activities by Russians that Mueller is now investigating. What is being said is that President Trump was put in the office or abetted by the Russians, and people go on to say that he is therefore in some way under the control of the Kremlin and therefore treasonous. So I see here two crises, and with this I'll stop. One, a crisis of the American presidency. This has never been said by an American president before, so far as I know. And secondly, a crisis of American-Russian relations, because we are now in a Cold War much more dangerous than the preceding one, and we have to ask ourselves, if we don't trust our president to keep us out of a nuclear conflict or any kind of war with Russia, are we doomed? And these are the consequences of what we call Russiagate, for which I can find no factual evidence.
David Sanger, no factual evidence. The Mueller 37-page indictment did have a lot of facts in it.
It sure did, Fareed. And when you go through the 37 pages, what you get are intercepted conversations between people who are working in this troll factory, as we call it, a 4-story building in St. Petersburg, who were churning out the Facebook posts, the Twitter posts, the advertisements that were calling on Americans to come out in the streets, sometimes to bring both sides of a divisive issue out in the streets at the same time in Florida and New York and in Texas. And clearly, Mr. Mueller had access to some intercepted American intelligence. He didn't say where some of this came from. And it appeared, if you read the indictment carefully, that they've also turned some people who they didn't name, but who were participants in all of this. So I don't think there's much of a question that it happened. Now, to Mr. Cohen's question, did it affect the election? Has it created a crisis? We don't know. And Mueller does not state that it had any effect on the election. And I think the reason the president was so upset with General McMaster, his national security advisor, is that he didn't restate what Vice President Pence said, which was it had no effect on the election. We simply don't know what the effects were, and we may never know that.
Let me point out, the so-called troll factory in St. Petersburg began as a strictly commercial operation a number of years ago to promote the guy's restaurants. He then learned that if you got fake people to say his restaurant was great, business ticked up. So he began to sell this service, sort of fake news service, to Russian politicians. And the market was so good, he decided to expand it to the United States. The people who have studied this have been able to, and don't even claim that it's had any impact on our elections. And let me add to what David Sanger said, Neil McFarlane, reported in the New York Times, there is no evidence it was even tied to Russian intelligence, and McFarlane says it's unlikely that it was because it was such a clumsy, essentially commercial operation. Now, are we really going to endanger the American presidency and our relations with Russia with what is not truly, so far as we can see, hard intelligence, factual, but scuttlebutt? I mean,
all right, let me ask David, the sort of central question I imagine that Mueller is looking at is whether the release of some of this data that you know, the Hillary Clinton emails and such, was in some way coordinated with the Trump campaign. And it seems to me that is where you get at the issue of not the Russian interference, but also the issue of whether there was some connection or collusion with the Trump campaign.
It's a very good question, Fareed. I think the president was initially quite happy with the indictment because he looked at it and it indicted a group of Russians. And you know, you didn't hear much criticism of Director Mueller or Special Counsel Mueller for that indictment because he was going only after Russians. The next indictments may well look at the, we don't know this for a fact, but we believe that one of the things he's looking at are these intelligence agency connections that went into the DNC and into John Podesta's emails. And then would come the question, were they getting any guidance, any coordination from anyone in the campaign? There's been no evidence of that, hard evidence out there yet, other than what you described, which has been the overall statements the president and some others in the campaign made during the campaign. And it's very possible that the Russians didn't need any guidance, that they seem to be pretty savvy about how to operate in the American political environment. It's also possible that there was some level of communication. And I think as the president got increasingly upset last weekend, as he thought about the indictment, it's because it struck him that that's the direction that Mueller is going.
Fascinating stuff. I'm sorry we got to leave it at that, but we will be back on this topic with both of you. Thank you both.